Imagine a giant pie sitting on a table. Now imagine 5 or 6 hungry people rushing to the table, grabbing knives and fighting to slice up the biggest piece for themselves. That is essentially what happened during the age of new imperialism. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, powerful nations like Britain, France, and eventually the United States decided that their borders weren't big enough. They used their military and political power to take over other lands, not just to visit, but to own and control. It was a global land grab that changed the map of the world forever. Why did they do it? Historians like to use the 3 G's to explain it: gold, glory, and God. First, gold. Everyone wanted money, resources, and trade. Second, glory. If you had more colonies than your neighbor, you were seen as more powerful. And third, God. Many Europeans believed it was their religious duty to spread Christianity to places they considered heathen. So, while some were there to rob the land, others were there to save souls, and often, those 2 goals got very mixed up. Let's look closer at the money part. Remember the Industrial Revolution? Factories in Europe were churning out products like crazy, but they had a problem. They were running out of raw materials. You can't make tires without rubber, and rubber doesn't grow in England. They needed secure sources of oil, tin, and copper, but they also needed customers. If a British factory makes 1 million shirts, they need 1 million people to buy them. Colonies became the perfect solution. They provided the raw materials to make the stuff, and then they were forced to buy the finished products. Now, you might ask, how did they sleep at night knowing they were conquering other people? Well, they used a twisted version of science called Social Darwinism. You know, Charles Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest in nature? They applied that to humans. They argued that because Western nations had better technology and weapons, they were biologically superior. It was a racist ideology used to justify why it was natural for them to rule over Africa and Asia. It wasn't just greed in their minds, it was nature. This mindset was famously captured in a poem by Rudyard Kipling called The White Man's Burden. The poem suggested that white Europeans had a heavy responsibility, a burden, to take care of and civilize the non-white people of the world. It painted colonization as a charity mission, like they were big brothers helping little brothers. Of course, this ignored the fact that these little brothers had ancient civilizations, complex histories, and didn't ask for help, especially help that involved machine guns. A most dramatic example of this was in Africa. Look at a map from 1880 and you see independent African societies. Fast forward just 30 years and the entire continent is color-coded by European ownership. This was the scramble for Africa. It happened so fast it makes your head spin. Only Ethiopia and Liberia managed to stay independent. Everyone else, from Egypt to South Africa, fell under European control. It was a frantic race to plant flags. To prevent the European countries from going to war with each other over Africa, they held a meeting in Berlin in 1884. Picture a fancy room full of European diplomats looking at a big map of Africa. They drew lines on it saying, "I'll take this river, and you can have that coast." Guess who wasn't invited? A single African leader. The borders they drew paid no attention to where actual tribes and ethnic groups lived. They split friendly groups apart and forced enemy groups together, creating problems we still see today. We have to talk about one of the darkest chapters, the Belgian Congo. King Leopold II of Belgium didn't just claim the Congo for his country, he claimed it for himself personally. It was his private property. He needed rubber for the booming tire industry. His private army forced Congolese villagers to harvest rubber quotas. If they didn't meet the quota, the punishment was often having their hands chopped off. Millions died. It was essentially slavery by another name. Hidden deep in the rainforest, over in Asia, India was the prize. Britain called it the jewel in the crown because it was the most valuable colony they had. At first, a company, the British East India Company, actually ruled India, which is wild to think about. Imagine Google running a country. But after a massive rebellion called the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857, the British government took direct control. This period is known as the British Raj. They built railways and schools. Yes, but they also restructured the entire economy to serve Britain, not India. China was a different story. China didn't want anything to do with the West. They had tea, silk, and porcelain, and they only wanted silver in return. The British got tired of this trade imbalance, so they started smuggling in opium, a highly addictive drug. When China tried to stop it, Britain went to war, the Opium Wars, and won easily with their steamships. They forced China to open up. Soon, Europe and Japan carved China into spheres of influence, where foreign laws applied on Chinese soil. Japan looked at what happened to China and said, "We are not letting that happen to us." Instead of fighting the West with old swords, they decided to become the West. This was the Meiji Restoration. They modernized their army, their schools, and their industry at lightning speed. And then they did exactly what the Europeans did. They became imperialists. They invaded Korea and beat Russia in a war. Japan proved that industrial power wasn't just a Western thing. For a long time, the United States stayed out of the colony game. George Washington had warned against foreign entanglements, but by the 1890s, the U.S. wanted to sit at the cool kids table of world powers. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, the U.S. acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Suddenly, America was an empire with overseas colonies. It caused a huge debate back home. Could a republic founded on freedom really own other people? The U.S. also realized it needed a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific for its navy and trade ships. The answer was Panama. But Panama was part of Colombia, and Colombia said no to a canal. So the U.S. encouraged Panama to declare independence and sent gunboats to make sure it happened. In exchange, the U.S. got to build the canal. It was an engineering miracle, conquering landslides and yellow fever. But it showed just how far the U.S. would go to get what it wanted. The U.S. also realized it needed a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific for its navy and trade ships. The answer was Panama. But Panama was part of Colombia, and Colombia said no to a canal. So the U.S. encouraged Panama to declare independence and sent gunboats to make sure it happened. In exchange, the U.S. got to build the canal. It was an engineering miracle, conquering landslides and yellow fever. But it showed just how far the U.S. would go to get what it wanted. Managing these huge empires was tricky. There were two main styles. France liked direct rule, sending French officials to run everything and trying to turn the locals into French citizens. Britain preferred indirect rule. They would find a local sultan or chief and say, "You can keep your title and your palace, but you answer to us now." It was cheaper and caused less immediate rebellion, but the puppet strings were always there. Don't think for a second that people just rolled over and accepted this. There was resistance everywhere. The Zulus in South Africa famously defeated the British Army at the Battle of Isandlwana with spears against rifles. In China, the Boxer Rebellion tried to kick out all foreigners. The problem was the technology gap. As one writer put it, "Whatever happens, we have the Maxim gun, and they have not." The machine gun changed the math of resistance. Economically, colonization totally warped local systems. Before, a farmer in India might grow wheat to feed his village. The British came in and said, No, grow cotton for our factories. This is called cash crop farming. It made money for the empire, but it meant that if the cotton price dropped, the farmer starved. It also destroyed local industries. Indian weavers used to make the best cloth in the world. The British taxed them out of existence, so Indians would have to buy British cloth instead. The impact wasn't just on maps and money, it was in the mind. Colonizers brought their languages, their religion, and their education systems. In many colonies, if you wanted a government job, you had to speak English or French and dress like a European. This created a loss of culture. Traditional history was often ignored or rewritten. Indigenous children were taught that their own ancestors were savages and that the colonizers were saviors. That kind of psychological damage lasts for generations. When the Europeans finally left, they left a mess behind. Remember those random borders drawn in Berlin? They trapped groups that hated each other in the same country. This led to horrific civil wars in places like Nigeria and Rwanda. Also, the economies were broken. They were built to export raw materials, not to build things. So even after independence, these new nations were still dependent on Europe to buy their goods. It's a shadow that still hangs over the developing world. All this competition for colonies eventually backfired on Europe. Germany wanted what Britain and France had, and they got jealous and aggressive. The tension over who owned what piece of Africa or Asia ramped up the military buildups that led to World War I. And when the war started, it was a world war because of colonies. Troops from India, Africa, and Australia were dragged into European trenches to fight for empires that didn't even give them the right to vote. So, how should we look back on this? It's easy to see the railroads and hospitals and say it brought modernization. But we have to listen to the voices of the colonized. We have to look at the resource theft, the racism, and the violence. History is usually written by the winners, but as we uncover more records and stories, we see that imperialism wasn't a heroic adventure. It was a massive transfer of wealth and power that created the unequal world we live in today.